thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. I'll introduce you quickly. This is Jason, who runs the back end for Ocean. Most of what I know and what I relay, particularly when it comes to certain technical topics in Bitcoin, is basically me just relaying stuff I learned from Jason and Luke, of course, because I have the privilege of working with these two guys. So a lot of stuff that finds its way onto this channel is just from me badgering Jason all day and just saying, how does this work? How does that work? So funny thing happened since we launched Ocean. We found 3 empty blocks in the space of around 40 blocks or something, which is absurdly unlucky, but not impossible either. And it led to a lot of speculation, and it's one of the most I've never seen more people that should know better being wrong about a topic than I have empty blocks. So with that, I thought I would just, rope you into doing a video quickly on why empty blocks happen, why we
Yeah.
do the empty block speed up in the first place, why not doing it anymore is a net negative for everyone, not just miners, not just pools, not just the Bitcoin network, but everyone loses if we don't have these things. So I guess I'll just run through the hypothetical scenario. So, we're mining on a pool. You're a miner, you're connected to a pool. The network just found a new block. It wasn't your pool, it was someone else. What are you doing as a pool as of that instant?
Well, I mean, what you need to do is validate that block. So you don't want to build on something that you don't know is valid. Some pools have tried that in the past and it's worked out very poorly for them. So you want to have the whole block. You want to make sure it's a valid block. And then you immediately want to get all of your miners building on top of it. And the way you do that is by sending the smallest work possible to every worker that's connected to the pool. And that's going to be an empty block.
Okay. What would happen if you decided to not send the empty block, but fill it with transactions instead? So assuming you could do that at the same time, it would take you to construct an empty template. I know that's not necessarily possible, but supposing as a pool, you can either send an empty template or a full template, and which one would you choose to do?
So, and it's worth pointing out that when we do send the empty block, if done correctly, we do already have that whole template ready to go. So we've already validated, we've already created a template for the new block, but we're sending the empty work anyway because it's still the fastest way to get the miners onto the latest work that's not stale. So we're still building on the correct chain. If there were no network restrictions and no bandwidth limitations, like if we had infinite bandwidth between the pool and every worker that was connected to it, then sure, we would just send the full template at that point. We've already got it. But we can't do that because that's not, it's the real world. We have actual limitations with how these things get communicated.
Right. So if you were to send, I think a lot of people don't understand the practicalities here of dealing with a remote mining farm with no proxy, because as we've established, the proxy software that's out there for miners isn't great. So
Right.
what this can realistically mean is 10,000 ASICs sitting in a warehouse somewhere in the middle of the desert or wherever, and you're trying to send a tiny amount of data to 10,000 machines, all connected to something that isn't a particularly good internet connection. That's a lot of bandwidth that's required. So if you can shave a few bytes off here and there by sending an empty template, you can save collective thousands of hours by giving
Yeah.
them an empty template, right? Do I have that
Yeah.
correct?
It really depends on the bandwidth of both the pool and the miner and how many workers. But in aggregate, yeah, I mean you're exactly correct. We're saving. It may come out to less than a second per block or something, but over time. I mean, you're talking 6 seconds an hour, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this all adds up. Any seconds doing the wrong work is just wasted effort. So why do the wrong work when the empty work can get there almost instantly? Like not instantly, but a lot faster than the full work. I mean, realistically, the full work is going to be at least 3 to 4 times larger per worker to send on the wire. Most pools are actually worse than that. Some of the pools that do like a lot of merge mining and stuff, like their empty work is still large, which in my opinion, they're doing it wrong. But yeah, you want to get the workers on the latest chain as quickly as possible, and there's just no way to do that in the real world without like sending the smallest amount of data possible.
Yeah. So one thing that people always like to do, I mean, you brought up the bandwidth on both sides there.
Hmm.
The bandwidth from the pool, we could have a reasonable expectation that that would be big, right?
Right.
A well-established and respected pool is going to have extremely good connectivity and extremely high
Sure.
bandwidth. The point is that we just can't expect that from miners, right? And
We can't expect it from the miners, and as the pool grows, I mean, you also have to keep in mind, I mean, we're slicing that pie down still. So you might have a lot of bandwidth at the pool side, but when you have 100,000 workers, for example, well, you've got a limited amount of bandwidth per worker still. So you still have to keep that in mind. We still don't have unlimited bandwidth on the pool side. We have a lot,
hmm,
but the miners, especially like these remote sites, like a lot of miners are very remote, and they might be working off of say like DSL or some LTE connection at best, or some like fixed wireless, or even Starlink now. All of these are going to have a lot of latency, and they're going to have limited bandwidth. Like Starlink on a good day, when it's using the ISL links, will be like 15 to 20 megabit. If you're trying to run 10,000 workers off of that, you're going to run into some bottlenecks.
yeah, it's amazing how there isn't, like, using a proxy can make all this so much better, but there's not really much out there, right? You have Brains,
Right.
Farm, you have what else do you even have? I don't
There,
know.
there's a there's a couple of older open source ones. Nothing that I've seen, and don't hold me to that because I don't look at everything. But the ones that I've seen, none of them have been updated to use ASIC boost, and a couple of the newer
Well,
extensions
that's a
like
non-starter in today's
right,
environment.
yeah, and you have to have ASIC boost. But so far, I mean, most entities don't seem to use it, and a lot of miners that I've personally spoke to didn't even know that a proxy was an option.
Right.
Um, so yeah, they're not using them, and so that brings this problem into that. Now we can't go to the miner and be like, well, you're just going to lose money because you're not using this proxy that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That seems like a like a bad way to go about it.
Yeah, I agree. So let's go back to the common misconceptions here. When people see an empty block, they always reflexively or instinctively go, the pool must have taken to. First off, the pool shouldn't have sent that empty template in the first place ever. There's always two
Mhm.
conversations here. The first one is, why are you sending empty templates? It's a bad thing. So let's address that one first. Um, frankly, my opinion on this is that people are just ignorant of the purpose of having more confirmations of a transaction. And a perfect real world example of this is you're opening a Lightning channel. The transaction you did to open it is in the blockchain. Great, but
Right.
every single Lightning implementation out there says you need several confirmations. Usually, I think 6 is the default in both cases of CLN and LND. So if your transaction is in the chain, and you're still unable to use the Lightning channel because you need it to have more confirmations. That's just how Bitcoin is designed. It's the more, the deeper your transaction is in the blockchain, the more confirmed it is. So if someone comes along and mines an empty block when you're waiting for your channel to finally be in the locked-in state, you're grateful that that block happened. And this is not a cherry-picked example. In all cases, you want your the deeper your transaction gets in the chain, the less likely it is, or the more work someone's going to have to do to rewrite history and make
Exactly.
your transaction invalid. Or
Yeah, I mean that's the whole concept of Bitcoin. I
right,
mean, it's the blockchain. The
right,
more proof of work there is built on top, the more secure everything before it is, and the empty blocks do that.
yeah,
I think I think one of the things some people don't realize is like it's something like an eighth of all blocks that have ever been mined are empty. It's a lot. I mean, it's not. It was way more common like when there weren't very many transactions to be mined, but it's still these have all contributed to the security of the network. Every empty block confirms every block before it. And that's a net positive for the network. For the miner that mined it, I mean, yeah, you could argue, oh, well, they could have added all these transactions and gotten fees for it. Okay. Or we could have missed that because it took too long to get to one of our workers and they would have been mining stale work. And then we're just creating contention for no reason.
yeah.
Um,
That's an intuitively everything about the way your intuition would guide you when it comes to empty blocks is wrong, which is why
right.
there's so much misinformation out there. It's not that if it's not that there were no transactions in this empty block you just found, there could have been. It doesn't work like that. If you hadn't sent the empty template, the miner just would have been mining stale work instead, and
Exactly.
that's useless unless you're a huge pool. But I mean, we'll get into like what you might be able to do with a stale block if you're a big pool in the future. And this
Right.
again, I've seen this characterized as like a virtuous thing if you're a massive pool to not do the empty template speed up. And it's the opposite. It's a manifestation of centralization, and one of the main reasons we didn't want big blocks, because if you're building on top of your own blocks all the time, you constantly have an advantage over other people that have to download your block and verify
Sure.
it before. So this was if there were 10 megabyte blocks or 50 megabyte blocks, whoever the biggest pool is constantly going to keep having a head start in every race to find a new block. So
Exactly.
obviously the biggest pool in the network wants big blocks because they don't have to keep downloading other people's as much as other people have to keep downloading theirs. So the idea, well, this is a tangent already, but Foundry are the notable ones. They're the biggest pool, like at least if you're not if you naively look at the chart and you see Antpool a smaller size than Foundry, you might be forgiven for thinking, they're the biggest pool. But regardless,
Right.
Foundry are one of the biggest pools, and they don't do the empty block speed up. This just means their miners are doing more stale work every time there's a change,
Right.
a new block found on the network. But if one of those, if one of their miners finds a stale block, Foundry have the ability, pretty credibly, to build on top of that stale block, and then the rest of the network had the correct block, so to speak. Foundry found a competing stale block, and then there's a race condition, but then you can have Foundry find yet another block on top of that stale block, and then the one everyone else thought was real is now discarded by the network because it's no longer the
Exactly.
longest, valid proof of work chain, right? So that is not a good thing if that happens. That's an unfair advantage to the biggest pool, which would incentivize more centralization. So them not doing this in service of that, I'm not saying that's what their motivation is. It can also just be appearances because everyone has such a misguided interpretation of why empty blocks happen that a pool that doesn't do them, most people celebrate them and go, well done. Like, because they're not aware of what I'm trying to outline, lay out in this video.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind. I mean, the empty block speed up is a thing at all because everybody uses Stratum. So the way Stratum works is we have to send the Coinbase transaction along with the Merkle leaves for every transaction in the block. So it comes out to like maybe 1600 bytes or so for a full template and maybe 400 bytes or so for an empty one because we don't have anything except the Coinbase transaction. Um, and that's just the way that protocol works. So there's ways to improve that with an alternate protocol, like Stratum v2 has claimed that they'll have the next template ready, which is crazy to me for other reasons. And if we want to get on that tangent, we can. But but yeah, I mean, there's ways to improve it by having more information available. Like if the miners are making their own templates, they'll already have their own local template, and the bandwidth consideration isn't as much of a problem. But then again, that's basically a proxy. So there's a lot of nuance to it where like with Foundry, yes, they're able to just immediately jump on their own block. We recently saw that there was a stale race between them and Spiderpool. What was it, yesterday? Um, in context of the video, where they just kept mining on their own block. And even after Antpool mined on top of the other one, Foundry stayed for moments on their original chain just to give it that extra little boost. And their miners don't really care either way because from the miners perspective, whether they're mining stale work or valid work, Foundry's paying them either way. It's FPPS. So if the pool hasn't switched, then if FPPS is going to keep paying them, the miner doesn't care. They could be mining on whatever chain they, it doesn't matter because the pool's still going to supposedly be paying them. So there's a lot of different nuance to it, but why exactly they wouldn't want the pool itself to make the extra bucks off of the empty blocks is beyond me. That's I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's also a lot of talk around transaction fees, right? Which is,
Right.
I mean, you can't escape the fact that one day an empty block is really a very sad thing for a pool to find instead of a block full of transactions, because a block full of transactions will have a lot of money in it, and a
Right.
subsidy only block will have barely anything. Right now, it's the opposite. Right now, you have, even after the halving, you still have 3 1/8 Bitcoin in subsidy, which you get in an empty block. And then you have, just looking randomly at the last block Foundry found 7 minutes ago, it has half a Bitcoin in transaction fees. That's higher than it's been for a while. The fees
Yeah,
are
it's
up in
actually
the
headed back
30
up, it
sat
looks
per
like.
byte range at the moment. It's been around 8 sats per byte. So the fees are not particularly high. Miners losing out on fee revenue. I mean, what is that? That's, half a Bitcoin versus 3 1/8 Bitcoin in subsidy. At what point would you say the trade off stops being worth it? Where you say the empty blocks are just, uh, the subsidy is so bad and the transaction fees are so attractive that we're going to stop doing the empty block speed up.
You need more information to make that determination because it varies per instance, like per worker and per farm. Like for example, we have that remote farm that we kind of use as the example, like that's on a low bandwidth connection with 10,000 workers. Well, there is a break even point there where on average, if they were mining stale work for this long and we were able to get so many onto a full template in a reasonable period of time versus an empty block, there's a break even point there. And it varies from like situation to situation. There's no
Mm,
one size fits all on that. It's all a trade off. You're gambling either way. You just want to stack the deck in your favor whenever possible. And there is a point there, and I think it's somewhere around a third of the subsidy is where you would want to really start considering not doing the empty block
mm,
speed up for most instances, but it still doesn't hold for that, even with all of them. But yeah, around a Bitcoin in fees right now would probably be where I'd be like, okay, maybe most of our miners could get a full template, but at that point, like it's still a trade off. Now we're risking a stale block that could have been 3.125 Bitcoin on the hopes that in that moment we're going to mine one that's worth four. I usually I don't I would want it to be pretty high in order to make that determination because I'd rather have the three versus nothing.
yeah, naturally.
But
Um,
again, it's all a trade off. You can do the math on it, but at the end of the day, you're still going to be doing some amount of stale work if when you send that full block of transaction, and stale
right.
work is worth nothing.
So, yeah, I get that. It's a naive question as I put it to you. It depends, is obviously the correct answer.
That
I
tends to be the
appreciate it.
answer to a lot of things.
So, I mean, the one thing that sort of flabbergasts me is the lack of understanding around the avalanche effect. Like people
Hmm.
think if you've solved, like people think this about pools, right? They think how come Ocean can send a template to a miner can solve that block, but can't. Why can't they just change where the coins go when they solve the block? How does pooled mining even work in the first place? Why can't they just pay all the? They've solved the block. Now can't they just change where the coins go inside that block and pay themselves or another pool? Like a lot of people think this, right? Because we don't know a lot about cryptography, right?
Hmm.
The point is you can't. The minute you change any detail of that kind inside a block, there's no malleability here. Then the block is unsolved again because
Right.
if you change any bit of information inside something that runs through these kinds of cryptographic algorithms, you get a completely different output, and it's random. It's not deterministic. Like you can't change one bit and it changes only one bit, and you just have to jerry rig it a little bit to resolve the block. No, you have to start again and solve the block again with the new payout address. So
Exactly.
that's why pools even work in the first place. But people look at empty blocks and they go, well, once you do that, can't you just stick a bunch of transactions in there once it's solved? Like, really, I've seen people that
No.
are like real Bitcoiners that are into this stuff not understand this. So, like, no, not trying to be like an ass about it. Like, no, none of us knew this stuff until Bitcoin came around, apart from
Right.
actual cryptographers. But like, that's just not how cryptography works, right? Like, you can't just stick transactions in a solved block once it's solved. And if you don't do that, you're an asshole as a pool. And why did you do that to the network, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, you got to work a little backwards here again. Like an empty block is good for the network. I mean, and no matter how you spin it, it's a good thing. If everybody was mining nothing but empty blocks, then that would be an attack. but that's not what's happening. People are using this as a way to um, basically to keep the amount of hashes that are useful at its maximum. And that's what it's intended for. I mean, if you're using it as for what it's intended for, to keep the miners doing useful work as long as possible, then the empty blocks are definitely a good thing for the network because they do confirm things. If you were mining nothing but empty blocks, all right, you could make an argument that that's not great. But kind of, and then working back through the cryptography aspects of it again, you know, like you said, if like right now, if Ocean sends an empty block template when the next block comes through, that will have the Coinbase that pays Ocean and miners, um, like from that block. And if you tried to change that, then when you submit that work to the pool's not going to recognize it as being the original data, and it's going to be like, okay, no, this isn't something that pays who it's supposed to. You're basically solo mining. So you can do that. You can change it and pay whoever you want, but you are solo mining at that point.
Mhm.
Um, which then you're not in the pool. So one of the things that people don't really realize is actual pooled mining is we're telling the hardware, try to find blocks that meet this particular difficulty that happens to be way lower than the network difficulty. So, and then every time the miner finds one of those blocks, it sends it to the pool, and the pool is able to verify that that was a block had the network difficulty been that low. Does that make
Wow.
sense?
That is something I've never understood until this moment because the
Yeah.
miners aren't mining at network difficulty, they're mining at pool difficulty and they're constantly
Right.
finding blocks. That is
Yeah.
that's a
They're blocks,
genuine
and
eureka moment for anyone watching. I had no idea how this worked until now. Right.
yeah, so I mean, and the pool is able to validate that every one of those blocks is a valid work for the pool that pays the pool and pays the miners. Usually it's paying the pool, but in our case pays the miners. It's able to validate that that is genuine work, and it would have been a block had it met the network difficulty. So all shares meet the share difficulty. The proof that's submitted to the pool meet the share difficulty, and some of those just happen to also beat the network difficulty and become actual blocks.
Amazing. So, um, I think we've pretty solidly established why you need a pool to issue empty blocks. And it's
Sure.
fundamentally just because the real world says, and this is not due to a pool taking ages. It's just to address all of the
No.
FUD because there's so much FUD around it. Some people said, oh, ocean blocks don't include spam, so therefore their mempools don't have as complete a picture. So when a competing pool finds a block and it has spam in it, it takes longer for them to process it, and therefore it takes longer for them to issue a new. Obviously, this isn't true. We have a core template
No.
too. We're aware of all the transactions everyone else is aware of that at least ever touch the P2P layer, right? Like when
Exactly.
Marapool finds a block, no one knows about that, right? It's full of
That's a little
garbage. No
different.
one knew about it. Everyone had to deal with that and everyone had to process it. Nothing was cached, or cached rather. In the case of Ocean, when we're constructing new templates that come from another building on top of a block from another pool that contains spam that wouldn't end up inside our default blocks, we still know about those transactions for the most part, and they're still cached because we
Yeah,
still
exactly.
the nodes inform each other in the way you've set up the network. If I understand that correctly, right? Like we have a core
Yeah.
template with default policy, and we know about all the spam, and we're not taken by surprise every time the 144 blocks a day we have to deal with on average. you
Yeah, I
know,
mean, if you look at the code for even core, there's an option for caching transactions that aren't necessarily that look valid but aren't necessarily able to be put into a block. And the way Knots handles the the spam is basically puts them in that bucket. So when we'll see the spam transaction over the P2P network, and we're like, okay, this could be in a block if somebody else finds it, but we're not putting it in there. So we'll just remember it. So when we get a compact block information for another pool's block, we do already know about it. We do know if that transaction has the correct signatures and such, and it's already processed. It doesn't take us any more time to do that. In fact, like even on, I was looking back earlier at what you were saying, like even with like Marapool, like those blocks don't take us much longer to process. We're talking tens of milliseconds, even if we don't know about any of the transactions. So it's not much. I mean, the actual verification time tends to be well under 100 milliseconds to get from we just saw a header for this block, we get the entire block data, we've already got a template ready for all the transactions that are in the next block. It doesn't take that much time. So that's not really the issue at all. The consideration is for the miners. We want to get them on the best work as quickly as possible.
Yeah. And here's where it gets fun, right? I think I've addressed most of the FUD here. It's not poolside like people assume. That's the main point I want to drive home here, because people have obviously used it to attack Ocean. And your intuition, I don't begrudge anyone using their intuition. Like, you found like
Right.
40 blocks and 3 of them were empty. Obviously your pool's broken. Like, I don't, that's, if you don't know much about it, that's a fair enough assumption, right? And if we found 10 more empty blocks, I would start to go, hey Jason, I'm sure something's up. Like, we don't
Something's up.
understand.
Yeah.
Like, sure, but in this case it does just seem like some sort
we,
of,
we we've just got incredibly unlucky with the timing on them. We found
which
some
is weird.
blocks like directly after some of the network blocks.
Right, but
I mean,
that's,
it just happens.
it's very strange to characterize that as bad luck, because it's incredibly good luck. That's that's the
Right.
weird thing.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at it from like the empty blocks bad perspective, I mean, yes, we've gotten some work that turned into a block immediately after some network blocks, and it's usually within a few seconds. Um, it's the miners can hang on to that work because they're allowed to. We're not going to tell them to discard valid work. That's going to find the pool to block. That's just silly.
Ah,
Um,
well, this is the clean jobs thing that everyone seems to not.
well, right, and the clean jobs. Like if you look back at when Stratum came out, when it was what like the first pools to do Stratum, like on Slush Pool, like when they developed the Stratum protocol, and the purpose of clean jobs was to make it so that the miner would make the determination, I need to get on this new job as quickly as possible and no longer send the old jobs to the pool. Like that, those are the tasks that the miner now has, the worker. And that made sense like back in the day when we had the GPU miners and some of the early slower ASICs and FPGAs where they could just immediately just discard the work and start working on stuff. Like, okay, yeah, clean job's true. We're immediately working on the next block. That doesn't take away any of the bandwidth considerations of an empty block, and those were even more so back in the day when like not everybody had gigabit residential connections.
Mm.
You've got a lot of delta there as well. So as we move on to today, where some miners you can tell them to clean equals true, to discard all the old work. Like, okay, they'll discard it, but the chips are very likely still working on that, and you can prove that with your own miners, especially some of the most popular ones. So they'll hold on to that work, but they'll just discard it when you say clean equals true, and that's fine when we're switching network blocks. The pool doesn't care about that work anymore.
Unless you're
Um,
Foundry.
and yeah, I guess unless you're Foundry. So the pool doesn't tend to care about that work anymore. So we don't want the miners sending it. And so we'll send the empty block with clean equals true. So now the miners do their best to get on that work as quickly as possible, and they do so. And then immediately after, it can be anywhere. It depends on, this is mostly bandwidth constrained at this point. It could be anywhere. It's usually about a second it takes to get the work to everybody for the full template from the pool side. Now, whether that actually makes it to all the workers within a second is to be determined. We don't know. We have no control over what happens once it leaves us. Um, so the pool blasts that information out as quickly as possible after the empty template, and eventually the mining hardware will switch to it. Some hardware does it almost instantaneously. There's a couple miners that, like, as soon as you send even a clean equals false work, the next share submission is going to be from that work within moments. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's some of them are good, others not so much. They'll continue submitting the older work until they exhausted their search space, which could be anywhere from a second to up to a minute in like a worst case scenario. So we're not going, when the pool gets that work back, we're not going to be like, oh well, no, that's just an empty block now, let's just throw that away. Well, that'd be crazy.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we accept it and we're going to send it to the network, whether it's 2 seconds later or 50 seconds later. Where as soon as we've got a block, we're going to send it to the network. Why wouldn't we?
Yeah, of course. And we've established that there's nothing wrong with an empty block, so
Right.
it's not a thing we're ethically obliged to not broadcast to the network once it exists. But
Exactly.
here's the point where it comes down into the practicalities of what the miners are actually doing. And I appreciate you just laying out what happens at the hardware level there. because it's so much worse, or it has been so much worse. It's kind of changing now with the main
Hmm.
miners out there, which are Bitmain and miners. So what will happen is you already said within tens of milliseconds you can process even the worst case block, which contains a bunch of transactions known to absolutely nobody that would include it out of band by a pool like
Right.
Marapool using
Yeah,
something like
as long as you've
Strixure.
got good peering and you can
Yeah.
actually get the data, which tends to be the case. I mean, I run a lot of nodes to get this data and to make sure that Ocean gets all the information it needs as quickly as possible to mine on the next block, without trying to cheat and not validate things.
Hmm.
So you've got to have the good peering to do that, and you've got to have enough nodes to make sure you have that peering. But yeah, I mean, you can get it. You can get it under 100 milliseconds.
Right. So that
Sorry, I didn't mean to
being
cut you off there.
no, that's all good. So you're in that situation where you've sent an empty template because you have validated it. You validated it as quickly as possible via the having the setup you just outlined there.
Yep.
It takes well under a second. You're talking hundreds of milliseconds worst case,
Hmm.
but you've sent out the empty template just because it's faster to get the miner working on newer work quicker than if you send the full one. Just because that is that, but it's not a pool side constraint. It's to do with getting from the pool to the miner. That's the
Right.
delay there. That's why you send the empty block. But when you immediately follow up with the full work, which you do, you can even send both at the same time. In fact, that's probably what we do. We send both at the same time, but the full one ends up later. It gets to the miner more slowly because naturally it would. Is that correct?
Well, so what we actually do is we send all of the empty work and then start looping through sending all of the full work, like just back to back as quickly as we can.
Right. And
So
what's the time discrepancy there?
it tends to be under a second for the worst case. So usually, I mean, you'll see the empty work come in and then the full work will get sent out within a second. It just it depends on how much is going on at the moment, like because we do have nodes turning and there's load differences and bandwidth differences, but it's less than a second. Now I've seen that on like a low bandwidth test connection that it could be 2.5 seconds before somebody actually sees that full template work on their end.
Right. But the
I've
point
done
I
some
want to
tests
highlight
with,
here
yeah,
is
it's not the pool.
if it takes 2.5 seconds to get the full template to the worker after the empty block, it wasn't the pool taking too long to create it or dilly
No,
dallying for whatever reason. It was a connection issue. But that, so again, people holding the pool's feet to the fire over this is to be unaware of that constraint, which is
right.
far more significant than any of these other poolside reasons that might occur. Like pools, it is going to take a pool. Um, I'm not even sure this
Well,
is correct, but it is. There is some delay for a pool making a full template. Um,
it is non-zero. Yes, I
yes.
mean if we're making the template, it does take an amount of time, but there's no reason not to do that. We definitely want to verify the block. And by verifying the block, we've got the template basically for the next one. That doesn't take to go from verification to having the template ready is almost no time. So it's negligible enough to not count, but the validation part is the important part.
So we'll go back to the if validating is actually happening or not, because there's some conversation around that at the moment, and I'm unsure myself. So I'm curious to
Hmm.
hear what you have to say on it. Um, but the point I really want to get down to is if we can accept that empty block templates make sense for a pool to issue, which they obviously do, and for every reason you've just laid out here. Um, the actual reason you see so many empty blocks get found is we haven't even touched on yet, which is well, you started to when you talked about clean false and clean true,
Hmm.
is how long it takes what is currently the case for most ant miners out there to actually switch over to the new work because they have the
Right.
empty work and they will work on like this going right back to the situation of a new network block gets found when you send the empty work a ton of the chips on any antminer isn't going to even switch to the empty work. It's just going to carry on working on the stale work. And you said from your experience that it can be for up to 60 seconds before every chip is finally done working with whatever the prior work was. And
Yeah, it's like a very worst case. It's not super common, but yes, it
yeah,
can be very long.
it averages out after 3 or 4 seconds. You're at the tail end, right? Like
Right.
most chips have switched over to something new, right?
Yeah, pretty
So,
much. So you've got a few seconds usually. Um, I was actually in a chat with somebody else about some of the more technical aspects of this earlier. And there's a lot of reasons on the hardware level why this happens. Because in theory, the hardware is designed to do this as quickly as possible. You want to be on work that's going to be making you money. I mean, that's kind of the premise of mining. So you want to do this as quickly as possible, but there are limitations. Like you have to like the some people don't realize that like the mining the actual ASIC chip they don't want that to ever stop doing work. You never want to stop it. You never want to limit it so that it's doing work and using this power and then even for a moment doing nothing because that will change like the thermal properties and a lot of other things in the like the electrical design of the boards that they're on. So you want to keep everything as consistent as possible. And the way to do that is to make them never stop doing work. So you give them a slice of work to do, which will take some finite amount of time. And you give them that work, and then you give them the next work that you want them to do at some point before that one is done. And then when it's done, it will switch to that next work. Well, that amount of time is going to vary quite a bit from chip to chip because while they may be clocked the same, or you might broadcast the work to them all, well, some might fail checksums. There's going to be a lot of reasons why they stay on the work that they have, and most of those firmwares broadcast them frequently enough so this isn't too much of a problem. But the miner firmware is not going to discard that old work when a chip comes back. It actually explicitly checks, was this the last work we sent, the one before that, or the one before that? It checks a few back just to make sure that, okay, it was actually on this work. Because sometimes it doesn't even know what the chip is on. And that delay there can be anywhere from milliseconds to seconds. And in a worst case, up to like 60 seconds. In my own testing, I've gotten shares back from an Antminer that were 60 seconds old
right.
after telling you the new job. So it's not uncommon and it's not invalid. It's only when after you tell it to clean the work, yes, you don't want the pool getting stale work anymore. But once you tell it a new job, it doesn't necessarily have to switch to that job immediately. It's just got to get on it as soon as it can get on it, and they do, and that takes some amount of time. So you end up leaving that empty work in some chips, and it still keeps working on that for some number of seconds, and it might find that 5 6 seconds later. You add in network latency for the amount of time it takes a whole farm to get on the same work. You add in the 1 second or so it might take between the empty and the full work from the pool. You add all this up, you're easily at 10 seconds.
Hmm.
It's not super uncommon to see that, and I think somebody had posted recently that like okay after like 5 seconds seems to be about when most of the empty blocks tail off, and that pretty well fits with a decently connected um, farm and a bunch of miners that hold on to work for a little while. It's not too crazy.
Yeah. So again, it's you're looking for a cause, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this does seem to be a design of Antminers that makes them hold on to work for longer that you've picked up on in your testing, and you've
Yep.
tested, micro BT watts miners, and you're saying I think you said they've never gone outside of 3 seconds to completely switch over to new work. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, and that's been a worst case. I mean, the micro BT stuff is pretty quick
Yeah.
to get on there, and I've seen some of the Bit Fury stuff is pretty quick. But the Antminer stuff, and from now, I will point out that I initially thought that this was a limitation of the hardware itself until I saw Antminer put out an update for one of them that Bitmain put out an update for one of them that actually improved it significantly. I haven't dug into the details of how they pulled that off yet, but apparently it works. So they've actually gotten to the point where that firmware on the one that I've tested with, I've not seen higher than about 4 seconds.
This is
So
this is very interesting that they actually did this because
I'm surprised as well. I didn't think that they were looking into this, but maybe there's been enough scrutiny around the empty block thing.
Or
Um,
maybe the ASICs they use themselves have never done this. It's just
it
that,
could be.
yeah.
But
So
so it seems like something somewhat solvable in firmware for them. So that's a good thing. It's not as dire of a problem as I initially thought it was, but it's still a problem.
sure, but the motivations are pretty questionable. Like if you're the main manufacturer of mining hardware and you also run a pool,
Hmm.
and you have this incredibly poorly designed ASIC that can be doing bad work, because it's not just empties that it can be doing for 60 seconds, it's also stale work
Right.
that's competing with a block that the entire network has already accepted for over a minute now, and all the other pools are building on top of it. You're going to
Hmm.
ship miners that carry on doing that crappy work to all of the other your customers who are also your competition because you mine yourself and you're running a pool. I mean, this is why Luke doesn't want Ocean to mine, right? Like
Right.
there's a reason you don't want your pool to be, as a pool operator, you don't want to be in competition with people that are using your hardware. But I mean, well, it's not like we sell ASICs. But so I find
Right.
it pretty conceivable given how unbelievably dishonest Bitmain have been in the past and how malicious they acted towards Bitcoin. Um, I find it pretty conceivable that they had this fix for ages. The empty blocks started happening recently because it's Ocean, with our astounding 0.2% of the network. Everything we do blows up. Like,
Of course.
if I hiccup, there's a massive like complaint about it because it's so
There's going to be
controversial.
4,000 tweets about it.
Right. So for we found a bunch of empty blocks, and there was a massive controversy around it. Everyone made the wrong assumptions, and we started going, look, guys, the main reason these empty blocks are happening is because antminers do old work for ages. So there is no case where if an ocean block is found, I don't know what the timestamps were, and I'd be interested in getting into that because if an ocean block is empty and it's 8 seconds after we saw the block before it, there is no
Hmm.
way that is due to anything else other than either extremely bad internet on the miner's side or they were using an ant miner that was just mining on work. But there isn't a case where it's 8 seconds after the last block. An ocean still hasn't figured out a full template yet. It's only
No.
a scenario. There is no scenario where that's actually what happened. So I mean, it can happen where like an empty block is like 40 milliseconds after the last block. Like that can happen, but that's not what is happening. The time gap between the empty blocks and the prior network block, at least when Ocean saw them, right, it's
Yeah.
going to be
So I mean,
multiple seconds.
yeah, you look at the last empty block we found. Um, it took us under 100 milliseconds to validate it and to have the empty work starting to go out to miners. So within 100 milliseconds, that was happening. And from the time we knew about the block to the time the pool stopped pushing full templates was zero point 0.8 seconds.
Right.
So less than a second. That's the time it took for every node that we have to stop pushing full work. Four and
So
a half seconds after that, we got the work back from an antminer saying, "Hey, I solved this empty block."
right. So that is an issue with the cause of that is, yes, we sent an empty template, but the miner carried on doing work on the empty template after it had long since had. I mean, that's what three. What is
About
that?
about
Yeah.
3 point. It was 4.1 seconds. Sorry, so it was 3.3 seconds after we were done sending empty work. Now, again, that's network latency as well between the pool and the miner.
Mhm.
However long it took the work to change on the miner, plus getting it back from the miner. So there's network things in there too. I would guess that the miner carried on at least for another 2 seconds doing the work after it got the full work. There there's no other way around that. I mean, we're not there's not very many miners with us that are that slow, and this particular one I know is not. So on the network side, I mean.
Right. So, in my disagreements with Blue Matt and various other people that want to attribute empty blocks to other things, one of the things he said was the general way. This is how Mempool explained it before I corrected it, and then they removed my correction and made it wrong again, um, which is a lot of fun. Um, what has been what people like to attribute it to is always instinctively the pool is doing something. It's taking too long to come up with the full template. And a miner has solved this block before it knew about the new template. The miner solved the empty block because it didn't have anything else to work on yet because the pool took too long. So, like every one of our blocks, or most of the empty blocks you see on the network will disprove this, though it's really hard to timestamp in a way where everyone can agree
Right.
that's when the last block happened. There is no firm and fixed time. And the fact that we can't all agree on an exact order of events is why you have a blockchain in the first place, to give you like a workaround for this. This is literally the Byzantine generals problem, right? So, you know, yeah, I think I'm uncomfortable here because I know you have a hard stop in 2 minutes. Is that right?
I do. I mean, we can get back to it if you like after that, but
Uh,
it's up to you.
yeah, well, and there's a couple more points I wanted to go over. Like
Well,
maybe you can just
let's
give
take a
maybe
let's
you can
take
give
a
me a
quick.
quick one on empty blocks sometimes happen like 5 minutes after the last block. I've seen that happen. I'm just, there are multiple causes, right? Maybe you can speak
I
to
would
why you'd
blame
have
the
some
pool on
anomaly.
that. The miner, if it's 5 minutes after, I mean, there's something wrong with the pipeline there.
Yeah,
I've not seen a hardware issue where it would hold on to it for 5 minutes. That's just weird.
yeah,
But I have seen pools get stuck churning on templates. Like I think it was Spider Pool, like around the halving, was just stuck on empty work for ages. And they, for whatever, I don't know what the underlying reason was, but they just never sent a full template. And that can happen. I've had that happen. There was a bug years and years ago where, for whatever reason, I couldn't get a template to validate. So Eligius was just sending empty work for like 45 minutes.
right.
um, but that was a bug on the pool side. So that's generally some. If it's more than a minute, I would say it's definitely a pool thing. But um, but other than that, I don't know.
All right. I appreciate it. I had some questions around SV2, but I think I'll have to. I guess we'll hop back on after your call or whatever.
I was gonna say we can jump back on if you like.
Yeah.
Happy to keep going.